They laughed at her the way people laugh when they think someone is invisible. Not loud at first, not cruel enough to get called out, but soft chuckles behind hands, whispers that followed her down hallways, looks that said she didn't belong in the same dream they were chasing. If you had asked anyone back then who would end up with the prince, her name would never have come up. She was the girl they mocked, the girl they overlooked, the girl they were sure would stay exactly where she was. She grew up on the edge of everything that mattered. Not poor enough to be pitied, not important enough to be noticed. While other girls practiced smiles in mirrors and planned futures that sparkled, she learned how to disappear in plain sight. She learned how to lower her eyes when people talked over her. She learned how to swallow words before they could turn into hope. It wasn't that she didn't dream. It was that she learned early how dangerous dreaming could be when the world kept reminding you who it thought you were. The prince, though, was very real. Not just a fairy tale title, but a man with power, status, and a life everyone wanted to be part of. He moved through rooms like he belonged everywhere, like doors opened before he even reached them. People leaned in when he spoke. Cameras followed him. Conversations changed when his name was mentioned. To the girls around her, he wasn't just a person. He was a prize, a goal, proof that they had won at life. They chased him openly. They dressed for him, laughed louder around him, competed quietly but fiercely with each other. They studied what he liked, where he went, who he noticed. They spoke about him as if he were already theirs, as if choosing them would be the most natural thing in the world. And every time her name came up in the same space as his, it was only as a joke. She heard it all, that she wasn't pretty enough, that she didn't shine, that she was too quiet, too plain, too forgettable. Sometimes they said it directly, smiling like it was harmless fun. Other times they said it when they thought she couldn't hear. But she always heard. She always remembered. And every word carved itself into her confidence until she started believing them. So she stopped trying to be seen. She focused on surviving her days, on getting through moments without becoming the center of someone else's humor. She built a small world for herself where expectations were low and disappointment couldn't reach her as easily. She didn't imagine herself beside the prince. She didn't imagine herself being chosen. That kind of story was for other girls. Girls who were louder, brighter, bolder. What no one noticed was how observant she was, how much she listened, how deeply she felt. While others performed, she paid attention. While others tried to impress, she tried to understand. She saw things people missed because they were too busy being admired. She learned patience in a world obsessed with being first. She learned kindness in a space where kindness was often mistaken for weakness. The prince saw her before she ever believed he could. Not in the dramatic way people expect, not with fireworks or instant romance. He noticed her in small moments. The way she treated people who had nothing to offer her. The way she spoke honestly when she thought no one important was listening. The way she stayed true to herself even when it would have been easier to pretend. She didn't chase him, and that confused him more than attention ever could. Their paths crossed quietly. A shared conversation here. A thoughtful comment there. Nothing that made headlines. Nothing that made anyone whisper yet. To the world, she was still invisible. To him, she was becoming impossible to ignore. And the more he got to know her, the more he realized how rare it was to meet someone who didn't want something from him. Meanwhile, the mocking didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper when people sensed something changing. They watched her interactions with him and laughed harder, joked louder, reassured themselves that this was just a phase, a misunderstanding, something that would correct itself. After all, stories like this didn't happen in real life. The girl they mocked didn't end up with the prince. That wasn't how the world worked. She felt the shift too. The attention, the looks, the sudden interest in her movements. It scared her more than the mocking ever had. Being ignored had hurt, but being seen felt dangerous. She questioned herself constantly. She wondered if she was imagining things, if she was misreading kindness for something more. She braced herself for humiliation, for the moment everyone would laugh and say she had reached too high. But the prince kept choosing to sit beside her. kept choosing her company when no one was watching, kept listening when she spoke, really listening like her words mattered. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand that this wasn't a joke. This wasn't pity. This was real. When the rumors finally started, they spread fast. Whispers turned into shocked conversations. Smiles turned stiff. The same people who once laughed at the idea now watched with narrowed eyes, trying to figure out how this had happened. How the girl they mocked had stepped into a story they thought belonged to them. She felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The judgment, the disbelief, the quiet resentment. Loving him meant stepping into a spotlight she had never wanted. It meant standing tall while people waited for her to fall. It meant risking everything she had built to protect herself. And still, when he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. Because somewhere between the laughter and the silence, between being overlooked and being chosen, she had grown stronger than anyone realized. She wasn't the girl they thought they knew anymore. And the world was about to learn that the quiet ones, the mocked ones, the underestimated ones, sometimes carry the most powerful stories of all. But just as their connection deepened, just as the truth threatened to come into the open, something happened that would test everything. A choice. A reveal. A moment that could change their lives forever. And standing at the edge of it all, she had no idea whether the story would end in love or in heartbreak. The days after that moment felt heavier than anything she had known before. Every step she took seemed watched, every pause noticed. She could feel eyes following her, measuring her, comparing her to some invisible standard she had never signed up for. People who had never spoken to her suddenly smiled too much or asked questions that weren't really questions at all. They wanted confirmation. They wanted to know if the rumors were true. And she didn't know how to answer because she was still trying to understand it herself. She thought back to where it all began, long before the whispers and the tension. She remembered being younger, learning early that attention was something other people earned more easily. She had always been the extra, the background presence in group photos, the one cut off at the edges. While others were praised for being confident and ambitious, she was praised for being quiet and helpful, like those were the only safe traits someone like her could have. Over time, she accepted that role, not because it fit her, but because fighting it felt exhausting. The prince's world was the complete opposite. His life had always been planned, observed, and discussed by others. From the outside, it looked perfect. Wealth, influence, admiration. But behind closed doors, it was filled with expectations that pressed in on him from every side. He was expected to choose wisely, act carefully, and never embarrass the image built around his name. Every relationship he had ever had was weighed for what it could offer, how it would look, and who it would impress. That was why she felt different to him. Around her, he didn't feel like a symbol or a prize. He felt like a person again. She didn't ask him about his status or his future plans. She asked him about his thoughts, his doubts, the things he never said out loud. With her, there was no performance. And that scared him more than any public expectation ever had. Still, neither of them said the words out loud. Not yet. The space between them was filled with unspoken feelings and unanswered questions. Each conversation felt meaningful, but also fragile, like it could shatter if either of them moved too quickly. And all around them, the pressure kept building. The girls who had once laughed the loudest were now watching the closest. Some tried to be friendly, pretending the past hadn't happened. Others grew colder, their smiles sharp, their comments carefully disguised. They reminded her, subtly and not so subtly, of her place, of how different their worlds were, of how stories like this usually ended. She started to doubt herself again. Late at night, alone with her thoughts, she replayed every interaction, searching for signs she had misunderstood everything. She wondered if she was being used as a distraction, a temporary escape from expectations he couldn't yet face. The fear of being humiliated, of being proven foolish in front of everyone, sat heavy in her chest. At the same time, walking away felt impossible. Not because of the title or the attention, but because of how seen she felt when she was with him. For the first time, someone had chosen to look past the version of her the world had decided on. Someone had taken the time to know her story, her silences, her strength. And that kind of connection doesn't let go easily. The prince faced his own doubts. His advisors noticed the change in him. His family noticed the shift in his priorities. Questions were asked. Warnings were given. He was reminded of his responsibilities, of alliances, of how his choices affected more than just his own heart. He listened, but his thoughts kept returning to her, to the calm he felt in her presence, to the honesty that was so rare in his world. Every meeting between them now carried more weight. A glance that lingered too long. A conversation cut short by someone entering the room. Moments stolen in quiet corners, away from curious ears. They both knew they were standing at the edge of something that could change everything, and neither of them knew how to step forward without causing damage. The mystery around their connection only grew. Social circles buzzed with theories. Some said she was manipulating him. Others said he was rebelling for attention. No one considered the simplest explanation, that two people had found something real in a place built on appearances. And the more people talked, the more dangerous it became for them to stay silent. She tried to return to her old habits, to shrink herself back into the background, hoping the attention would fade. But once you've been seen, truly seen, disappearing isn't so easy. People noticed her absence now. They asked where she was. They speculated even more. And every attempt to protect herself seemed to pull her deeper into the story she never meant to be part of. There was also her past to consider. The life she had built before all this. The small dreams she had buried because they felt unrealistic. Being near him stirred those dreams awake again, and that frightened her. Hope had always come with a cost, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pay it. One evening, as they stood together in a quiet space away from the noise, he looked at her like he wanted to say something important. Something that could finally bring clarity or chaos. She felt her heart race, her instincts screaming that this moment mattered. That whatever came next would change the direction of everything. Before he could speak, footsteps echoed nearby. Voices approached. The moment shattered. They stepped apart, the distance between them suddenly louder than any words. The interruption felt intentional, like the world itself was resisting what was trying to unfold. As she walked away that night, she realized the tension wasn't just about love or status anymore. It was about courage. About whether she could stand in her truth even when others tried to rewrite it. About whether he could choose his own path when every tradition pushed him another way. Neither of them knew how much time they had left before a decision would be forced upon them. Secrets don't stay hidden forever, especially when too many people want to control the ending. And somewhere in the background, plans were already being made, conversations already happening, that could pull them apart before they ever had the chance to come together. The story was moving forward, whether they were ready or not. And as the pressure tightened and the stakes grew higher, one thing became painfully clear. The girl they mocked was no longer invisible, and that made her the most vulnerable she had ever been. The tension began to slip into every corner of her life. Even the smallest routines felt different now, heavier, like they carried meaning she never intended. When she entered a room, conversations paused for half a second too long. When she spoke, people listened with curiosity instead of indifference. It should have felt empowering, but instead it made her chest tighten. Attention had never been safe for her. It had always come with judgment. She started noticing how divided the world around her had become. There were those who quietly rooted for her, often people who had been ignored just like she once was. They didn't say much, but their eyes softened when they looked at her, as if her story gave them hope. And then there were others, louder ones, who believed she was disrupting an order that had always worked in their favor. To them, she wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a problem. One of the girls who had chased the prince the hardest watched everything unfold with a forced calm. She smiled when she needed to, laughed when others laughed, but inside, she was unraveling. She had spent years shaping herself into what she believed he wanted. Every choice, every appearance, every connection had been calculated. Seeing him drawn to someone who hadn't played the game felt like an insult to everything she had sacrificed. And she wasn't ready to lose quietly. The prince felt the pressure closing in too. Meetings became longer. Conversations turned indirect but pointed. People spoke in careful phrases about responsibility, image, and future stability. They reminded him of alliances that could strengthen his position, of relationships that made sense on paper. No one mentioned her name directly, but it hung in the air between every sentence. He felt torn between the life he was expected to live and the one that felt honest. He began to notice how differently he was treated when she wasn't around. The warmth disappeared, replaced by formality. It made him question how much of the affection he had grown up with was real, and how much was tied to what he represented. Being with her had cracked something open inside him, something he couldn't ignore anymore. And yet, choosing her openly would mean challenging a system much bigger than either of them. She tried to prepare herself for that reality. She told herself not to expect promises, not to imagine outcomes. But her heart didn't listen. Every shared silence between them felt intimate. Every unfinished conversation felt like a thread pulling her closer. She knew she was walking into something complicated, something that could leave her exposed in ways she had never been before. There was also her family to consider. They noticed the changes in her, the way she carried herself now, the tension behind her smiles. They asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. They worried about her being hurt, about her being used. They reminded her of how the world treated people like them, how quickly admiration could turn into cruelty. Their concern came from love, but it added another layer of fear. The whispers grew sharper as time passed. Stories were twisted, intentions questioned. Some claimed she had planned this all along, that she had waited quietly for her moment. Others said she was naive, that she didn't understand the danger of stepping into a life like his. Every version erased the truth of who she actually was. No one asked her how she felt. No one cared to know. The prince overheard things too. Comments made when people thought he wasn't listening. Doubts planted intentionally, like seeds meant to grow into regret. He was warned that people like her didn't belong in his world, that the difference between them would eventually cause damage. He pushed back, but the repetition wore on him. Even the strongest resolve can weaken when surrounded by constant resistance. There were moments when they almost spoke openly. Moments when the air felt thick with words waiting to be said. But fear always arrived first. Fear of consequences. Fear of what would happen if they named what was growing between them. So they stayed in the space of almost, suspended between truth and silence. Meanwhile, plans were forming without their knowledge. Conversations behind closed doors. Arrangements discussed in hushed tones. The future was being shaped by people who believed they knew better than either of them. And the closer those plans came to reality, the less time they had to remain undecided. She felt it one afternoon, a sudden sense that something was shifting beyond her control. The way people looked at her had changed again, this time with a kind of finality. As if decisions had been made. As if the story was moving forward whether she agreed or not. It left her unsettled, her instincts warning her that the ground beneath her was no longer steady. The girl who had once mocked her openly now watched from the shadows, carefully choosing when to speak and when to stay silent. Her influence reached further than it seemed. And though she never confronted her directly, her presence lingered like a threat, reminding her that not everyone played fair. The prince noticed the distance growing between him and the people he trusted most. He realized that neutrality was no longer an option. Doing nothing was still a choice, and one that could cost him the only connection that felt real. But acting too soon could ignite a conflict he wasn't fully prepared to fight. Every path forward seemed to demand a sacrifice, and neither of them knew which loss would hurt more. As night fell and the world quieted, she stood alone with her thoughts, aware that she was standing at the center of a storm she never asked for. The girl they mocked had become the girl everyone was watching. And somewhere between fear and hope, she wondered how much of herself she would have to give up just to survive what was coming next. The change didn't arrive loudly. It came quietly, almost politely, which somehow made it more terrifying. Invitations shifted. Schedules changed without explanation. She noticed she was no longer included in certain spaces she had recently grown used to. Doors that had been half open now felt carefully closed. No one confronted her directly, but the message was clear enough to feel in her bones. Something was happening behind the scenes, and she was not meant to be part of it. The prince felt it too. His days became tightly controlled, every hour accounted for. People stayed close to him in ways that felt less protective and more restrictive. Conversations were cut short. Privacy became rare. When he asked questions, he was met with vague reassurances, told that everything was for the best, that difficult choices were part of leadership. The more they spoke, the more he realized how little room there was for his own voice. When he tried to see her, it became harder. Meetings that once happened naturally now required effort, planning, and risk. And when they did find moments together, they felt heavier than before. The silence between them stretched, filled with everything they were afraid to say. She could see the conflict written across his face, and it made her heart ache. Loving someone shouldn't feel like preparing for battle, yet that's exactly what it had become. The whispers turned into expectations. People began to speak, as if an outcome had already been decided. Names were mentioned around him that had nothing to do with her. Futures were discussed as if they were contracts, not lives. She heard fragments of these conversations through others, never directly, always distorted. But the message remained the same. There was a plan, and she wasn't part of it. She tried to ground herself, to remember who she had been before all of this. The girl who survived by staying quiet. The girl who didn't need approval. But that version of her felt distant now. Being seen had changed her. Being close to him had awakened something she couldn't put back to sleep. And knowing she might lose it without ever having the chance to fight for it felt unbearable. There were moments when she considered walking away first, leaving on her own terms, disappearing before the rejection could become public. It would hurt less, she told herself. It would protect her pride, what little of it she had left. But every time she imagined saying goodbye without honesty, without closure, her chest tightened. She deserved at least the truth, even if it broke her. The pressure reached its peak when an announcement began circulating quietly, carefully, like a secret everyone already knew. It wasn't official yet, but it was close enough to feel real. People spoke with certainty now, congratulating each other, making assumptions. She felt like she was watching her own future being erased in real time. The prince finally realized how far things had gone without him. He felt anger rise, sharp and unfamiliar. For the first time, he saw clearly how much control he had surrendered by trying to keep everyone comfortable. The cost of that silence was standing right in front of him, hurting quietly, carrying the weight of a story she never asked to be in. He tried to reach her that night, urgently, but circumstances kept pulling him away. Meetings ran late. Obligations stacked up. Each delay felt intentional, like someone was buying time, keeping them apart until choices became irreversible. He feared that if he waited too long, he would lose the chance to speak at all. She waited, her nerves stretched thin. Every sound made her look up. Every message that wasn't his felt like another small disappointment. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she had imagined everything. Maybe she had mistaken kindness for courage. Maybe this was where her story ended, not with confrontation, but with quiet acceptance. Around her, people watched closely, some with sympathy, others with satisfaction. The girl who had once been mocked was now standing at the edge of something monumental, and not everyone wanted to see her survive it. There were those who believed this moment would finally put her back in her place. As the night deepened, the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Decisions were being finalized. Words were being prepared. A future was solidifying, brick by brick, without her consent. She sensed it, even without proof. The tension wrapped around her like a warning. Somewhere else, the prince stood alone, staring at a choice he could no longer avoid. Staying silent would protect the image everyone trusted him to maintain. Speaking up would disrupt everything, ignite conflict, and expose truths people worked hard to hide. He knew whatever he chose next would define him, not just as a leader, but as a man. Their story had reached the point where patience was no longer a virtue. Time was running out. Secrets were about to surface. And when they did, there would be no way to soften the impact. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for what she felt was coming. Whatever happened next would change her life forever. The girl they mocked was about to face the moment the world had been building toward. And whether she would be lifted or broken by it remained painfully uncertain. The moment she feared arrived in a way she never expected. It wasn't announced with celebration or ceremony. It came as a quiet confirmation slipped into conversation, passed along by someone who looked almost apologetic as they spoke. There was going to be an official appearance, a public event, one where the prince would not be alone. The name attached to him wasn't hers. The words hit her slowly, then all at once. Her mind tried to reject them, to search for another explanation, but the details were too specific to ignore. Dates, locations, careful language meant to control the narrative before it even reached the public. This wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a strategy, and she was standing outside of it. What made it worse wasn't just the announcement itself, but the timing. It was happening soon. Too soon. Before any truth could be spoken. Before any choice could be challenged. It felt deliberate, like a door being slammed shut just as she reached for the handle. She wondered if he knew, if he had agreed to it, or if, like her, he was being swept along by decisions made in rooms he wasn't allowed into. The not knowing was unbearable. It turned every memory into a question. Every look they had shared, every moment of silence, suddenly felt fragile. At the same time, another truth surfaced, one she had never considered. Someone had been feeding information. Details about her schedule, her conversations, her background. Things she had shared only in trust were now circulating in distorted versions. She realized then that this wasn't just about control. It was about removal. Someone wanted her gone from the story completely. The girl who once mocked her openly was no longer hiding behind fake smiles. Her confidence had returned, sharper and colder than before. She moved through spaces with purpose now, speaking to the right people, planting the right ideas. It became clear that this wasn't just jealousy. It was fear. Fear that the world was changing in a way she couldn't control. The prince finally managed to reach her, but only briefly. Their conversation was rushed, interrupted, guarded. There were things he wanted to say. She could see it in his eyes, but walls were closing in around them. He warned her without explaining too much. Told her to be careful. Told her that not everyone wanted the truth to come out. That warning changed everything. It confirmed what she had been sensing all along. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a battle being fought quietly, strategically, and she was right in the center of it. The girl they mocked had become a threat simply by existing in a space she was never meant to occupy. As the days counted down to the public event, the tension became suffocating. Media attention increased. Speculation exploded. Narratives were being shaped in advance, leaving no room for alternative endings. She watched as the prince's image was polished and positioned, while hers was slowly erased. Then came the second twist, the one that truly raised the stakes. A detail from her past surfaced, something deeply personal, something she had worked hard to leave behind. It was framed in the worst possible way, stripped of context, turned into a weapon. She knew immediately who had leaked it and why. This wasn't just about stopping a relationship anymore. It was about destroying her credibility. The fear she felt then was different. Deeper. More primal. This wasn't just heartbreak she was facing. It was public humiliation, judgment, and the risk of being defined forever by a version of her story that wasn't true. The same people who once ignored her were now ready to dissect her life. The prince heard about it too, and this time, he didn't hide his reaction. His anger surfaced openly, surprising those around him. But anger alone wasn't enough. He was being boxed in, forced to choose between protecting the institution he represented and protecting the person he cared about. Every move he made was being watched, calculated, countered. She considered leaving again more seriously this time, walking away before the damage became permanent. But something inside her had changed. The girl who learned to disappear had learned something else too. That silence doesn't always keep you safe. Sometimes it only makes you easier to erase. Support began to appear in unexpected places. Quiet messages, small gestures. People who had seen the truth but never spoken up before started to reach out. They didn't have power, but they had belief. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't as alone as she thought. The night before the event arrived like a held breath. The city buzzed with anticipation. Everything felt fragile, balanced on the edge of collapse. She stood alone, staring at her reflection, wondering how a life could change so completely without her ever asking for it. Somewhere else, the prince stood facing a decision that could no longer be postponed. The story the world expected was already written. But another version existed too, one that could only come to life if he was willing to risk everything. The girl they mocked had been pushed to the brink. The prince they chased was standing at a crossroads. And the truth, long buried under fear and control, was pressing hard against the surface, ready to break through in ways no one could fully predict. The day of the event arrived wrapped in a strange stillness, the kind that settles before something irreversible happens. The city buzzed on the surface, cameras ready, headlines drafted, but beneath it all there was tension thick enough to feel. She stood at the edge of the crowd, not invited, not expected, yet unable to stay away. This was the moment everything had been moving toward, whether she wanted it or not. She watched as the prince arrived, composed and calm on the outside, though she knew him well enough now to see the strain in his eyes. He looked like a man carrying a weight far heavier than ceremony. Beside him stood the woman everyone had been whispering about, chosen carefully, presented perfectly, a symbol of what was expected. The image made sense to the world. It fit the story they had already accepted. The announcer began speaking, words polished and deliberate, shaping a future that felt final. Applause rose and fell on cue. She felt her chest tighten with every sentence, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone could hear it. Part of her wanted to turn away, to spare herself the rest. But another part, stronger now, refused to move. Then something shifted. The prince raised his hand slightly, a small gesture that brought everything to a pause. It wasn't planned. It wasn't on the program. The murmurs began immediately, confusion rippling through the crowd. Advisors leaned in, whispering urgently, but he didn't look at them. His eyes searched the space until they found her. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The world waited. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it that couldn't be hidden. He talked about duty, about tradition, about the stories people tell when they think they know what's best for someone else. Then he spoke about choice, about truth, about how leadership without honesty was just another performance. The crowd grew restless. Cameras adjusted. This wasn't what they came for. And then he said it. Not her name, not yet, but enough to make the truth unmistakable. He acknowledged the manipulation, the quiet decisions made without his consent, the narrative built to protect an image instead of a person. Gasps moved through the audience. Faces stiffened. This was dangerous territory. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief. He was finally saying the words that had been trapped between them for so long. He took a breath, then continued, his voice firm now. He spoke about connection, about seeing someone not for their status, but for their character. About how the girl they mocked had shown him more honesty than anyone who had ever chased his title. And finally, he said her name. The reaction was instant and explosive. Shock. Whispers. Outrage. Cameras swung toward her, catching her unprepared, exposed. She felt frozen, the weight of thousands of eyes pressing down on her. This was the moment she had feared and imagined in equal measure. But she didn't look away. The woman beside him stepped back, her expression unreadable, and for the first time it became clear that even she had not known how this would unfold. The carefully crafted plan unraveled in real time, threads snapping one by one. The people who had worked so hard to control the outcome rushed forward, voices raised, trying to regain order. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it couldn't be neatly folded away again. As chaos rippled outward, something else happened, something no one had anticipated. The prince didn't step toward her. Instead, he stepped back. The crowd fell silent again, confused by the hesitation. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that glance was an apology and a question all at once. He spoke again, quieter this time, but no less powerful. He said that choosing her publicly, in that moment, would only turn her into another symbol, another piece in a story she didn't choose. He said love shouldn't cost someone their peace, their identity, or their safety. The unexpected twist landed harder than any declaration could have. He chose truth over spectacle. He chose to protect her, even if it meant standing alone. She understood immediately. The clarity hurt, but it was clean. For the first time, someone with power had considered what she needed, not what the world wanted to see. And that realization grounded her more than any promise ever could. She stepped forward then, surprising everyone, including him. Her voice shook at first, but she didn't stop. She spoke about being mocked, about being invisible, about how easily people decide who deserves a place in the story. She didn't beg. She didn't defend herself. She simply told the truth, and the honesty in it cut through the noise. When she finished, she turned and walked away, not in defeat, but in control. Cameras followed, questions shouted, but she didn't answer. She had said enough. Behind her, the event dissolved into confusion. Statements would be issued. Damage would be controlled. The institution would survive, reshaped but intact. And the prince stood at the center of it, changed forever by the choice he had made. Days later, the world was still talking. Opinions were divided. Some praised the courage. Others condemned the disruption. But one thing was undeniable. The story had shifted. And then, quietly, without cameras or announcements, a final surprise unfolded. She received a message. Simple. Honest. Not from the prince, but from an unexpected source. Someone who had once worked against her, now stepping forward with proof. Evidence of the manipulation, of the lies, of how close she had come to being destroyed for daring to exist outside her assigned role. The truth was finally complete. And as she stood at the beginning of a new life, no longer mocked, no longer invisible, she realized the greatest twist of all wasn't who she ended up with. It was who she had become. The days that followed felt unreal, like the world had tilted slightly and never fully settled back into place. The noise from the event didn't fade quickly. Discussions filled every space, from quiet corners to loud public platforms. People debated courage, responsibility, love, and power. Some tried to rewrite what had happened. Others tried to minimize it. But the truth had already taken root, and no amount of control could pull it out completely. She stayed away from the spotlight, not because she was ashamed, but because she finally understood the value of choosing herself. For the first time in her life, she wasn't reacting to other people's expectations. She was breathing freely, even though the future was uncertain. The girl who once learned to disappear had learned something better. She had learned how to stand still without shrinking. The proof that had surfaced didn't explode publicly the way people expected. Instead, it worked quietly, steadily. Conversations shifted. Certain voices lost credibility. The girl who had once moved pieces behind the scenes retreated from view, her influence weakened by exposure. She never apologized directly, but the silence spoke enough. Power built on manipulation rarely survives daylight. The prince stepped back from public life for a time, not as punishment, but by choice. He faced consequences, yes, but not the ones people predicted. What surprised everyone most was how little he tried to defend himself. He accepted criticism calmly, openly acknowledging mistakes, refusing to let others speak for him anymore. In doing so, he earned a different kind of respect, one that couldn't be forced. Their paths crossed again weeks later, away from cameras, away from expectations. No audience, no pressure. Just two people standing in the aftermath of something that had changed them both. There were no dramatic speeches this time. Just honesty. He apologized for the moments he hesitated, for the fear that slowed him down. She thanked him for choosing her dignity over a grand gesture. It was the first conversation they had that felt fully complete. They didn't rush into anything. There was no fairy tale ending written overnight. They spent time rebuilding trust, learning what it meant to meet as equals, not symbols. Whatever their future held, it would be built privately, carefully, without the need to prove anything to anyone else. And that choice felt more powerful than any public declaration ever could. Her life changed in quieter ways too. Opportunities appeared that had never been offered before. People listened differently now, not because of who she had been associated with, but because of how she carried herself. She spoke when she wanted to. She stayed silent when she chose to. The balance belonged to her. She also returned to the places that once made her feel small. Not to confront anyone, not to reclaim space dramatically, but to remind herself of how far she had come. The laughter that once hurt no longer had power over her. She had outgrown it. The people who once chased the prince learned something uncomfortable. That chasing status doesn't guarantee happiness. That the story they believed they deserved wasn't promised to anyone. Some grew bitter. Others grew quieter, reflective. A few even reached out, awkwardly, unsure how to bridge the gap left by their past behavior. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but it came honestly where it could. As time passed, the story softened. It became less about scandal and more about transformation. Articles shifted tone. Conversations evolved. The keywords changed. No longer just about a prince or a mocked girl, but about choice, self-worth, courage, and truth. About how real power often shows itself in restraint, not dominance. She began to understand that the mocking had never truly been about her. It had been about fear. Fear of difference. Fear of losing control. Fear of a world where the rules weren't fixed in favor of the loudest voices. And realizing that freed her from carrying the weight of other people's insecurity. The prince, no longer surrounded by constant noise, rediscovered parts of himself he had buried under obligation. He learned that leadership wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about standing firm when it mattered most. Losing some privileges gave him something far more valuable in return. Integrity. Their connection continued, not as a headline, but as a shared journey. Some days were easy. Others were complicated. But it was real, and that mattered more than perfection. They laughed more. They spoke honestly. They chose patience over pressure. In quieter moments, she reflected on the girl she had once been. The one who stayed silent, who lowered her eyes, who believed she was too small for big stories. She didn't feel sadness for her anymore. Only gratitude. That girl had survived long enough for this version to exist. The world moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. But for those who paid attention, something had shifted. A reminder lingered that sometimes the person everyone underestimates carries the strongest truth. That mocking someone doesn't define their ending. That love, when rooted in respect, can disrupt even the most carefully controlled narratives. In the end, the story wasn't really about marrying a prince. It was about becoming someone who didn't need permission to be seen. Someone who knew her worth before anyone else confirmed it. The girl they mocked didn't just change her destiny. She changed the rules.